Well, it looks like we're about ready to transition into our lunchtime presentation. So if I could have your attention in this direction, that'd be great. I talked about starting this venture, 20 years ago here at UNT. And one of the persons that's really helped motivate me and inspire me, and perhaps more than anything, caused me to think in so many different ways is the next gentleman who's going to present. When I graduated and I finished my dissertation on the effectiveness of music vibration for pain relief in rheumatoid arthritis, I had received a patent on a device, some technology, and I wanted to take it to the next level. And somebody told me, wow, you need to go to the engineering school at University of Texas in Arlington. And I went down there, I contacted the dean, and he said, oh, you need to meet this faculty named George Kondraske. And so I walked into Dr. Kondraske's office. I made an appointment, and one of the first things he asked me is that, is your last name like Chesky? And I said, yeah. He says, wow, are you related to Larry Chesky? And I said, yeah. And he said, wow, I listened to Larry Chesky's music when I was a kid. My father spun Larry Chesky records, and I love Polish polka music. And I play accordion. So we hit it off big time right away. And ever since those days, George has been involved with all kinds of projects that we've had here. The 2 conferences that I mentioned, he was very much a part of. And like I said, over the years, if there's any one person that stimulates my thinking more than anybody else, it's Dr. George Kondraske. PhD in electrical engineering and biomedical engineering, and a world expert on human performance engineering. His research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, by the National Science Foundation, by the Department of Defense, by NASA. And my list is very short in reference to what funding agencies have sponsored his work. And literally a world's expert in human performance engineering. And we can't be happier to have him here today. Give him a warm welcome, George Kondraske.
Thanks very much. Now, you have to be very observant when you're an engineer. And I observed one interesting thing when Amin was here, when he came up on the stage, and he's an audiologist, right? What does he say? First thing he said, do you remember? He said, can you hear me? Well, it's really a pleasure to be here today. And I will thank Chris and everyone at UNT for the opportunity to participate in this. And I've had the good fortune to work with Chris for many years now, 20 years, like Chris has said. Oh, is there a little, yeah, the pointer thing, I think. Yeah, just in case I need that. Let's see how this works, okay. And again, Chris has asked me to talk about engineering contributions to health in music education today. And I sat back and said, how am I going to do this? And I'm always future-oriented, but I think sometimes the best way to communicate what we can do in the future is to look at what we've been doing. They say the best way to predict the future is to look at the past. So I'm going to review some of the things that we've done in the past. Here's a chart that was included in a paper that Chris and I did, probably the first paper I think we co-authored together at a conference. And this is 1995. Look at the top, education, health, and performance, okay? And all these things work together. It's not only about, let's say, keeping people healthy, but it's also letting them maximize their performance abilities. And that's an interesting thing. One of the other areas I've done some work on is falls, and why do elderly people fall? Well, if you want to prevent them from falling, you just tie them to a bed, you know? They won't be falling. So how do you let them be active and not fall, right? It's a similar kind of thing we're doing here. And I think that it's important to look at some of these kinds of things here and the very many different activities that are involved that come down to performance. You got a problem, performance drops, right? You want to fix it, you got to get your performance back up again. Here's another 1997 Dallas Observer article. I've filtered out all the bad language, okay? We're pooling our resources, Chesky adds, describing the work that he says is right on the edge of being given an official, institutional, and fundable existence. in 1997, the Texas Center for Music Medicine then. And in the end, we talked then about combining our work, okay? And now UNT does have a college engineering school, so that it's a different game. But we've maintained and have, I think, done some interesting things by combining the understanding of the musicians and the problems and bringing to bear some of the things that engineers and engineering and human performance engineering can lend to the basic problem. So, these two entities working together. And I know Chris, and I have talked about other schools here, TCU, all kind of resources that we could bring to bear and really be the center for research in the nation and really the world on these kind of problems. So that's another point to keep in mind as we go through things here. So, talking about engineering contributions, what do engineers really do? Okay, well, we solve problems. I like to tell my students we design, build, and test things. That's a pretty good description. And so now everything else after this will be under the category of for example, okay? By the way, do you know how to tell if an engineer is an extrovert or an introvert? Anybody know? It's an extrovert if he's looking at your shoes when you're talking to him, okay? Think. One of the things we did involved the clarinet and problems that were associated with the hand in the right thumb area, okay? And we said, well, we got to start measuring forces here. We heard today the importance of force in musculoskeletal problems. So we developed a special sensor, two-dimensional sensor, that measured the forces, the axial force and the radial force on the right thumb for the clarinet. Study was carried out under different musical situations. We also looked at the effect of having a neck strap or not having a neck strap in this particular work. So this is one of the things we designed, built, and tested, and used. Presented this work, and you see a number of other people listed here that were involved at that early stage. Miriam Henoch, Bernie Rubin, who was at UNT Health Science Center at the time, John Scott, and also Michael Thrasher. Michael participated with Chris in first telling us what the problem was, okay, doing a survey, medical survey of clarinetists, and identifying that, looking at this, a survey-based statistical characterization, and that tells us where to focus our energy. So that was a very important thing. Michael is now at Florida State University, and we appreciate his contributions to that particular project. So another area, trumpet, okay, and here again, it starts with a survey to find out what kind of problems are associated with the trumpet, and really this particular survey covered other brass instruments. What do? We developed then a special sensor, a force sensor, that allowed us to measure forces while you're actually playing the trumpet and not mess up the whole musical performance side of things, and that's a pretty tricky thing to do. And we developed this sensor which measures forces along the axis of the trumpet, but also forces if you're left and right and up and down, basically, to put in simple terms. So we measure all the various forces associated with that, and we're going to hear a little demonstration here from James Ford in a minute. Here's James in his younger days, right, James? In our lab at UTA doing the first test of the sensor. And James is now with Cal State University of Los Angeles, and his dissertation focused on using this to characterize these forces. So again, a very landmark study, I would have to say. Also, Karendra Devrup, another student at the time who had contributed to this. And again, his work, it was published with Dr. Chesky in, again, looking at those forces. Oops, what's this? You know, design, building, and test stuff. You can build a force sensor, then what do you got to do? You got to build a calibrator in order to calibrate your force sensor. There's a lot of little pieces to these activities to make everything work just right. And that's, I think, important to recognize, again, the various players and the roles that people play in this very multidisciplinary type of activity. We did a presentation at the International Trumpet Guild, which was held at TCU. You remember, I think it was 2003, I think, right, Chris? I think so. And this is a little from a publication that Chris did at the time. And it identified me as a human performance engineer. And at that meeting, I presented a model. And that's another thing that engineers do. What do? We make models, okay? I always like to tell my students about models. I say it's the definition of a model is the most appropriate misrepresentation of the truth that allows you to accomplish something useful. Because no model is perfect. It's good to recognize that from the beginning. I'll be talking a little bit more about some of these models toward the end of this brief presentation today. Another area, intraoral pressure measurements. You're starting to get a little theme here, right? Measurement, measurement, measurement. I love measurement stuff. It's unbelievable. Do you know that at one time in the United States, the metric system was illegal? Illegal. Okay, you know why? Because vendors were trying to sell stuff with the metric system to confuse people so they wouldn't know how much stuff they're buying. Okay? It was unbelievable. They outlawed it. Measurement has a lot of fascinating stuff associated with it. The intraoral pressure measurement here is shown in the lower left corner attached to an oboe. There's Chris showing integrating this with the trumpet sensor to really get, combination of measurements. That's what's really interesting. What's going on with the intraoral pressure while you're measuring the trumpet forces too? This is, again, nobody I think has data like this. Michael Aducci participated in this, and you'll see his dissertation, which involved measuring intraoral pressure during oboe performance. During performance, that's the key. While you're doing stuff, what's going on? He's with San Jose State University. Hands, another area. This is a set of instruments that we developed not for just the music situation, but for measurement of hand performance and pronation, supination, speed, strength. We can measure a whole bunch of different variables here that represent the performance capacities for the functional units associated with the lower arm and the hand. Okay? This was used by Katrine Meidel. Is she here today? I thought she might be. She's at Ball State University. And again, you can see that she has done an epidemiological evaluation of pain in the hand, but she's also used the hand performance things. So we're looking at, is there a relationship between pain and performance capacities? We'll talk about that. When do you stress your performance capacity to the max, right? So you don't know if you're doing that unless you actually measure to see how much strength do you have, right? How much strength are you using is one thing. How much do you have is another thing. If you're using 100% of what you have, that's very different than 50% of what you have. The absolute amount you're using might be the same for two people, but in one person it's 50% of what they have, in another person it's 100% of what they have. Very different. No. Hands, pain, and piano. We talked a little bit, I think you heard a little bit about this, and the hand span stuff, that's one thing. But we had another project to look at forces and pain and how, when people strike a keyboard, how much force do they use? And again, how much is that relative to how much they have available? So we had to come up with special instrumentation that allowed us, to, with a special keyboard, to measure selected forces for certain keys based on, again, certain kinds of spans, looking at things that are, notes that were close together, keys that were close together versus far apart. And Eri Yoshimura, she did her work in this area, and she's recently did another paper, right, on hand span. Isn't that correct, Chris? And I had a look at that very interesting paper. It relates to, again, dealing with the fact that we have standard keyboards with keys that are so far apart, you have people with small hands and large hands, right? Chris actually shared the data from that study, and I looked at it a different way. Okay? Instead of pain, I like to look at the inverse of pain, which I call, for lack of a better term at this point, comfort. Okay? How comfortable are you? Okay? So the hand span versus measures of pain, but we converted them to comfort, and I produced this plot here, which is interesting. If you look really on the left-hand side, what you have is people who are not, well, comfortable, right? For the most part, on the horizontal axis. On the right-hand side of the horizontal axis, you get more comfort, right? And then we look at that versus hand span. What does this say? Well, everybody up there in the right-hand side, These are all individual, every dot is a, pianist, right? So what do those points mean? Well, it says that everybody, the lowest handspan there is about 188 millimeters, right? See that lowest dot? I don't know if I can get that on this pointer here. Let's see. Yeah, okay, there we go. So if you go over here, that's about 188 millimeters. Do you know what the distance is with one octave C to C on a piano? 188 millimeters. What does it say that? If somebody has a handspan that's 188 millimeters or larger, most of those folks are comfortable, right? You go over here now, and you have people on the left-hand side. There are some people who have larger than 188 millimeter handspans, but what? They're uncomfortable still, right? So it's not just about the handspan. There could be other factors that come into play, right? Handspan being one important thing, but you could imagine other factors that affect things that could be related to practice schedules, right? How much do these one person practice versus another person? Those things can impact these kinds of results. But again, it's sort of a different way that we bring to the table to think about things. Now, this is an old chart that I've used in the past before I even met Chris, okay? And it had on there all the different places where human performance comes into play. Not all of them, but pretty wide, but music was on the list at the time. And there's no question that performance of the human system is incredibly complicated stuff. So what I started doing maybe around middle of the 1980s was to say, it seemed like everybody was measuring things, but there was no rhyme or reason to how to go about doing it. And what I did was look for performance theory, okay? For system performance theory. So it must exist someplace. But I went through engineering school and everything, and I never had one course where they talked about it. I thought that was interesting. I went to the library, couldn't find it anywhere. So I realized then that I needed to develop systems performance theory. And I'm not going to go through all of that here, but it has influenced this modeling stuff that I was alluding to, and I'm going to end with talking a little bit about this modeling stuff. After we developed the basic core tenets of performance theory, and one of those tenets is to look at performance, the intangible stuff of performance, using a resource construct, which are tangible things we usually think about. So it's always the stuff you want to have more of. I want more steadiness, not more tremor. I want more accuracy, not more error, okay? I want more endurance, not more fatigue. So it cleaned up things, because before this we had, some things where a larger number meant you were better, some things a smaller number meant you were better. That was a mess, okay? That's one of the key tenets. Performance theory is not about human performance, it's about system performance. And then we came back to the complex human system and applied performance theory to all the little subsystems of the human system, and essentially connected it with the concepts of chemistry. What concepts of chemistry? Well, the fact that you have the periodic table, basic elements, right? Elements, a finite set of elements that you can combine in many different ways to get all the different compounds, and cake, and other kinds of things, right? It depends how you want to look at it. Well, that's what I said we needed to do with human performance. We needed the periodic table. What are the basic elements of performance, okay? And we identified a way to do those things. And what's really interesting as you start carrying this out is that the math of performance is the same as the math of chemistry. What do I mean? Well, if you're trying to make some compound that has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in it, right? And I got tons of hydrogen, and I got tons of oxygen, but I only have a little bit of carbon, that's going to be my limiting reagent. That's the thing that matters. And the question is, when you have performance, you have somebody trying to play a saxophone, a violin, a cello, whatever it is. Something is their limiting resource. We are always limited by something, especially when you're trying to achieve super high performance, right? That thing that's limiting people is probably going to be where injuries and damage occurs too, just like we were saying before. If you're using 100% of something you have, that's where it's really going to potentially be the hot spot. You got to look for that. We need to measure different things. So the concepts there, very simple. Resources, performance resources. How much do you have available? These are your capacities. For all the flexors and extensors and forces and ranges of motion, is speed. These are all your performance resources. Visual information processing speed is different than movement speed, right? We have tons of these resources, but they all make up the basic, the periodic table of human performance, if you will. And the tasks are like the compounds, right? Very simple idea, but very powerful in explaining and understanding things. Well, talk about modeling and everything. This is a paper that I just discovered. I knew about it, but I didn't look. I hate when that happens, you know? You know that something exists, you say, I gotta look at this, and finally you bring yourself to look at it, you say, why didn't I look at this 20 years ago? It drives you nuts. Anybody know Carl Seashore? Anybody, what do you think about Seashore? Awesome. 1915 paper, measuring musical talent. And I didn't realize this, but I later found that one of his students then became a faculty member at the University of Rochester Eastman School of Music. And in 1938, they started this big study called the Eastman experiment, trying to predict and what he called measure musical talent. Wow. I said, what happened to all this stuff? It was a 10-year study. It was fantastic work from the measurement side of things, okay? And it's unbelievable what he says in this paper. I sent the paper to Chris when I found it. And, you know, I said, you're gonna die when you read this stuff. And, you know, he called me back. He says, yeah, I'm dying, okay. It was very interesting. Well, other stuff. We talked about measuring hand things. Here's a device that we use to measure upper extremity coordination. We call it neuromotor channel capacity. Okay, it's the trade-off between speed and accuracy of movement, something that definitely comes into play in many musical tasks. We measure visual information processing speed with this device. We measure visual spatial memory capacity, which is also a very interesting capacity that's drawn upon when playing many musical instruments. This is just one device that we use. But we took this device and used it someplace else. We took it to UT Southwestern. We measured the performance capacities of surgical residents, and we used modeling based on the concepts of performance capacities and performance resources that I just mentioned to actually predict how well people did laparoscopic surgery, okay? We got excellent results. The traditional way for doing these studies is to use regression analysis. You get a whole bunch of variables you measure in the lab, you measure how well they do the surgical task or whatever the complex high-level task is, and you try to do statistical fits. What we have based on the performance theory approach is a cause and effect approach. And it's very simple. It's the laws of baking a cake. It's the laws of chemistry again. What's the limiting reagent, okay? I'll show you a little bit how we get at some of that. Well, we went to, with one of Chris's students at the time, I think Plano Independent School District, okay, to elementary school, 6th and 7th graders, not these people, I just put those pictures in there, okay? We didn't have any pictures for those. Okay. Sorry, had to be honest about that. We took that device that measures upper extremity coordination, as we call it, or neuromotor channel capacity, and here is neuromotor channel capacity compared to some measure of their, what we call band performance capacity, which is a rating by the teacher. Okay, so these kids are going to say, where are they going to go? Which orchestra, which band ensemble are they going to be in? Are they first chair, second chair? Those kinds of things. Okay, were used to come up with this variable. And what we do with this approach is say, let's go back here. If we look on the far right here, these are the super performers. Okay, they are in the high class. The question is, what's the least amount of that resource that you need in order to be in the super performance class? We don't fit a line through the data, we fit a line below the data. Because if you measure things, and they're always measured so that a larger number means you have more of that performance resource, and a larger number here means you're doing better on the complex task, well, that gives us a completely different way of doing what we call performance models. And this curve or plot we can call a resource demand function. it tells us how much of that resource you need to be in a certain level of performance. So you need to have, this is about maybe 7 in order to be a level like 2.5, and you need to have more to be at a level 5 band performance capacity for a high-level task, okay? Well, that's just one resource, right? You need more than just neuromotor channel capacity for one hand to, play musical instruments. So you have to develop one of these plots for every one of the resources that might be involved, okay? Well, we didn't do it for everyone. It was a quick study with just a few of those resources, but here's some of the results, okay? Where we're now saying, let's say this thing. There we go. Over on the left side, we've compared the instructor evaluation of performance capacity and our predicted level from our model, okay? And what you find is that just based on one resource, this is just one of the resources of the, let's say, 7 or 8 that we measured, we are already finding good agreement where we found somebody who's a 3. And that's what the instructor said. Because you know why? That resource was their limiting resource, okay? That's why we found that one. Everybody else is up here. What's going on here? We're predicting that they're better than they are, okay? These points, that's what it says. Why do we predict that because we're only looking at one resource. They're not limited by that resource, okay? It's very interesting to think about that. On the right-hand side, we have another plot, and you'll notice now this is the same thing, but we're basing it on 5 performance resources. You can start seeing some of these dots that are over here have come down closer to the line of perfect prediction, if you will. Because, and it's really interesting to see as you go from 1 resource to 2 resources, they start dropping, because you're finding that this person is limited by that resource, that person is limited by this resource, and you're finding those things. But even with measuring 10 things, there's no guarantee you found the limiting resources, because look how many resources go into something like playing musical instruments. But you can do some pretty powerful stuff. This is what Seashore was trying to do starting in 1915. It's unbelievable. He did so many great things, but he didn't have systems performance theory, okay? And thinking about, he was still more in a statistical kind of mentality. He was a psychologist, fantastic work, fantastic work. His bio is unbelievable to read. All right, well, one of my latest projects that we haven't yet brought to bear in the musical community involves taking some of our measurements that we did in the lab and trying to make them web-based. So all you need to do them is a computer, okay? It's interesting, because a computer has this thing they call a keyboard. How many people think keyboards are going to disappear forever? What do you think? Computers. Interesting, yeah. There's always a little bit of that in the literature, that they're gonna, but they don't, okay? Well, this is something we've developed, RC21X, based on connection with Roberto Clemente and his family, okay? And it's a brain performance capacity measurements. His jersey number was 21. That's why it's RC21X. And it's about a 15-minute test. The beauty of this is that we can get all these kids in these schools taking these tests, okay, that measure their visual information processing speed, their visual spatial memory capacity, and even some neuromotor, not only cognitive stuff, but neuromotor stuff. And I do have one quick example, I think, that should work. I'm not sure what makes, there we go. Let's see if this plays.
This task challenges eye-hand coordination, focusing on your right hand. With your right hand, make a fist and extend the finger next to your thumb. After the start bell, tap back and forth between the A and the L keys for 10 seconds. Move as fast and as accurately as possible while trying not to tap other keys. Keep tapping until you hear the stop bell. You will do this twice, with a 5-second rest in between.
So these are designed to be self-administered, okay? Again, it's a trade-off of speed and accuracy. When you type faster, what happens? You make more mistakes, right? There's a trade-off. It's almost anything involving information processing in the human system has a trade-off between speed and accuracy. If you want to get more of both, you have to increase the underlying capacity, which we call neuromotor channel capacity. Okay, diseases and injuries can affect neuromotor channel capacity, no question about it. we're probably born with different amounts or capacities based on some wiring. There's been some work done to show that there's sort of predilection to having a lot of this kind of capacity. Can't do much to change it. This is the end of my presentation, except we're going to switch over to James here in a minute. I put this picture in here, it was up in Chris's lab, because I'm trying to figure out who he's talking to. But he looks like a maestro, doesn't he? And I mean, I really have to say, it's been amazing watching what he's been able to do in the last 20 years that I've known him here too. And this event today is just one of the latest things. And I know many of you who've worked closely with him just really appreciate the things that he's done. I appreciate it. I'm just thrilled to be having the opportunity to be involved in these things. So let me take a few minutes here now. We're going to have James Ford. James. We're going to switch over the display to another computer. And it's connected up to the force sensor that I mentioned for trumpet force. And I'm just going to turn it over to James. You can see, maybe just take a moment to identify what's going on. We're measuring forces at the top, the three lines, and then we get into horn angle. So if you tilt the horn differently, we have an angle sensor in there that measures the way it's held. And again, what is the relationship between the angle and forces is another very interesting issue that could affect the way we teach people even, for example, right? And then there's a metronome wound, sound level. We're not going to deal with those too much. James will play a few pieces, and you'll see what happens to the forces while he's doing it. Go ahead.
Not warmed up anymore, but we'll do it anyway.
It's kind of cold in here, that's what he said,
It was 100 degrees in LA this week.
So where did you see most of the force? Which plot? 1, 2, 3, the third one, right? That's the one that's along the axis of the trumpet. Okay. Typically, in the study that you did in your dissertation, what do you find? You find that higher notes are more force, correct?
Yes.
In general, on the average. Anything else?
I will play a little bit more and then we'll talk about it.
Okay.
This is just a small excerpt opening from A2 by Longinati. And you see there's a little time delay here as the system is still showing forces that he was generating toward the end. If you look at the numbers that are involved there, it's in newtons, and he's probably dealing with and some of the larger numbers were about 15 newtons. 15 newtons, there's about 4.45 newtons per pound. Okay, so that's what you're getting close to about 3 or 4 pounds of force along that axis. You remember what the highest force you found in your study was? It was about 100, right?
Yeah. It was like somebody had 25 pounds of force on their lips, okay? That's like, the 25-pound barbell thing. You're sitting it on your lips. That's just unbelievable. Keep going, James, doing great.
And I'll play a little bit of one of the standard pieces of literature for the trumpet. I'll just play the introduction for the Artunian trumpet concerto.
getting up there around 25 newtons on some of those louder passages that he was playing. And again, see, just think about these, you know, the amount of data you can get from something like this and how you might be able to use that kind of data. Now, again, what I really want to look at other kinds of things too, like we just have people see how much force they can generate. Again, it goes, you know, capacities. Neck issues come into play too, the neck muscles. So I think there's a lot we could look at in future studies like this. And again, if we can do it for the trumpet, you know, again, that's something we've done already. We presented this sort of a little bit at that International Trumpet Guild meeting. What I was amazed is people who came up afterwards, people who play trumpet, right? And what did they say? Hey, you know, can I get one of these? Because they wanted to, you know, practice with it and see what how it affects things. So that might be something, you know, Chris made all these announcements, you know. We're thinking about trying to come up with something cheaper than that, you know, which we think we can do now because that technology is already old. And there's now newer technologies that we can use. And that's something that's always going to be happening. We're always getting better and better technologies to address these kinds of things, even into hearing and stuff that we've been talking about. It's just fantastic to think the things that can be done. So the time is right. That's what Chris told me when we were talking about this meeting here today. He said the timing is right. And when he told that to me, I knew he wasn't talking about my accordion playing. Okay? Go ahead, James.
So now I'm going to switch it over to some more commercial and jazz type of playing. So this next thing is going to be a transcription I did of a trumpet player named Snooky Young on a song called I'd Be Serious About the Blues.
He's actually saturating the system for where we have it set up for measurement now, okay? That's, you know, again, little exercises, you know, these, think of, you know, we're still processing this data which was collected. What year was that, James? 04. 04, okay, we're still talking about how to process it. And one of the things that we're talking about most recently is say, all these forces while you're playing, we want to come up with one number that says something, okay? So we're talking about looking at the cumulative exposure, almost like a dose. I think that ties into, you know, hearing methodologies, for example. And it makes a lot of sense when we're dealing with forces like this, too. I'm eager can't wait to see how that turns out. And then we need more of those sensors. We need more people doing things like that so we can, you know, lead people, you know, collaborate with people at various places and integrate data sets to get fantastic results. Big data, everybody hears about big data, right? How many places music schools are there in the country? You know, how many, you know, middle schools, high schools, and all these different things come to play. The big data opportunities are fantastic for these kinds of things.
And this last thing I'm going to play, I've been very fortunate in LA to have played with a lot of, several major artists. And being in the sessions, it's interesting to put some of the stuff that I learned here in North Texas into practice. He mentioned about how much resources that we have when we perform. I remember one of the first sessions that I went to, I went home and I was like, man, I'm super tired. I was like, man, I gotta do the same thing tomorrow. And I was trying to figure out, it's like, how am I gonna manage this? I managed it just fine, but I went back and, you know, thought about some of the meetings that we had, some of the times I spent in Chesky's lab practicing this and figuring out, okay, this is where the forces are, but I don't want to be playing at 100% all the time. How can I bring down where I'm playing nice and comfortable around 75%, but know if I need to push it, I still have that little 25% to play with. So even though I'm measuring a lot up there, up here, I don't feel a thing. because I went back to some of the pedagogical things that I learned from Candelaria in the studio, from the breathing, also my posture. I rechecked all those different, these different measures to make sure I was doing everything as the best I could. So this last little excerpt I'm going to play for you, we did for Earth, Wind, and Fire probably 2 years ago. This is called The Rush Is On. And again, just more the pop type of stuff. So sorry, singers, for your ears. I see you over there. I'll try to aim that way.
Thank you, James. Great stuff. Well, I'll leave just with a couple comments that trigger off, again, some things that James was talking about. And I go back to these performance resources, these intangible things, strengths and ranges of motion. Actually, I don't like range of motion. I like extremes of motion. You know, you go so far this way, and you go so far the other way. You know, grip strength is an interesting thing, you know. If you look at measures of grip strength among healthy people, and then we look at the tasks in the world that require grip strength, other than pickle jars, okay? And we say, how much grip strength is needed to execute those tasks? It's about in the mid-range, okay, of what people have available. So it's resource capacity available, it's how much you use, right? How much does a task require? But the utilization is different than how much you have available, right? Okay. And utilization relates to not performance capacity, but behavior. Okay, it's not performance. I like to talk about the difference between performance and behavior. And you know, how you play, and the playing so that the sound is not so loud, and still achieving high quality music, right? You know, that kind of, that's a behavior thing. I think we've heard even that word and saw that word on other slides. But performance is about capacities. That's how much you have available, right? That's what you can do, okay? Behavior is what you do. And I always tell people that you're trying to get your do up to your can do, maybe, you know? Okay. So it's important to think about these three different things. Resource available, that's your capacity. Resource utilization, okay, how much you're using when you're doing a task. And then really how much is demanded by the task itself, you know? Putting on a shirt is not a task description. Putting on a shirt in 2 seconds versus putting on a shirt in 10 seconds. They're two different tasks. You know, so you have to bring the quantitative aspects of all tasks into play. I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to talk with you today and meet with various people so far, and I'm not done yet. So, again, thanks, Chris, thanks, UNT, and appreciate your attention today. Thank you.
Thank you.